Let me take just a minute then and introduce our panelists. For those of you that have been to Connect conferences before, this is becoming an annual event where we have a panel of subject matter experts or people with vast experience in higher ed. And for many folks, it's kind of the highlight of the conference because of the viewpoints that are represented and so forth. My job is not to put these folks on the spot, but to kind of encourage a discussion on a variety of topics. And they'll be interacting with one another, and hopefully it'll be illuminating for you folks. If we have time, depending on how the discussion goes, we've got mics here too, so we'll invite some of you to ask questions and participate and follow up with things that the panel says. Let me introduce these folks to start with. To my left is Richard Garrett. Richard is the Chief Research Officer at EduVentures. EduVentures is a large policy and research firm based in Boston that focuses exclusively on higher ed issues and topics. Many of you have probably seen some of their reports and findings. He also combines his work with EduVentures with leading the Observatory on Borderless Higher Education, a think tank focused on global developments in online learning. 20 years experience in the UK and the US in higher ed. Next is Scott Campbell. Scott is the Vice President at the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning, or commonly referred to as CALE. CALE is a wonderful organization that encourages and helps primarily adults, but any kind of student, translate their life experience and their expertise into college credits, which can shorten their time to degree dramatically. Scott has over 20 years of leadership experience too. He was at one time the executive director of the Partnership Development Program of what's called New Ventures of Regis University. Regis is a university based in Denver, one of the leading early adopters of online education. And they formed this partnership program that kind of shared their expertise with other universities around the country. Also was the Dean for Graduate and Professional Studies at Edgewood College in Madison, Wisconsin, before coming to CALE. And last but not least is Trace Urdan. Trace is the Managing Director and Senior Analyst at Credit Suisse, covering the knowledge service sector. That means for-profit education, education technology, education policy. He tracks this industry very closely. He's widely followed and quoted. I don't know if he moves the market, but his analysis is pretty important to a lot of people. He's also a working member of a group on innovation in higher ed, sponsored by the American Enterprise Institute and the Gates Foundation. So a wealth of experience here, different points of view, and looking forward to the discussion myself. So let's get started, gentlemen. You feel free to interact with one another, push back on things that I ask about. We might as well jump into an important topic, which for me is finance, the cost of higher education. At Learning Health, we do a survey every year of online college students, and price is now the #1 factor in them picking a college. And tuition going up, they're looking at lower price institutions. So some colleges are trying to actually reduce price or lower prices. Do you think that's a good idea? Should we be trying to bring tuition down? And do you have any suggestions on how colleges and universities could do that? Trace, you want to start with this one?
Sure. Yes, it's a good thing. I think that you're seeing the market sort of work more actively, kind of the way that it should, to push towards that. I think it's prompted a lot of innovations that a lot of them have been talked about here in terms of alternative forms of education, alternative forms of acquiring credit. At the same time, that market pressure absolutely places pressure on traditional institutions that often have a lot of constraints on their finances and are maybe less equipped than more focused institutions on ways to manage costs. So it's not without its complications, but it's, I don't think I'm saying anything too controversial to suggest that the pace of inflation and the cost of higher education is something that's not sustainable. So it just seems inevitably that pressure is going to force a lot of changes, and I think a lot of innovations, and hopefully the sort of, forward-looking, adept institutions will, kind of take advantage of those innovations and sort of survive the price pressure.
Sure.
Well,
go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, I would say from a leadership perspective, it depends. As a dean, I looked at my graduate programs and tried to look at the marketplace and see where I fit. I knew some of my programs, whether it was an MBA program or other types of master's programs, we weren't going to be the lowest cost in our marketplace, but we needed to distinguish ourselves. And we actually did some elasticity studies and found that in our particular case, that it was we needed to look more like the high-priced institutions and offer at a more reasonable rate than the highest, but we weren't going to be the lowest. So to differentiate ourselves in the marketplace was really important. The other aspect of it is looking at access and having a clear mission and knowing who we are in that mission and who we want to serve. I think there's places where we need to be thoughtful about whether it's serving diverse populations or serving underserved populations that we need to be, in order to be a robust education leader, we want to serve our community. So it really is a leadership, whether you seek to be less expensive is really a part of knowing who you are as an institution.
So you were concerned as a leader that if you're low priced, you look cheap or this low quality, and it conveys that image, which has been a concern of higher ed leaders forever, I think.
Well, and at the time I was at a private institution, we were not going to be the lowest price in our marketplace. And so to be clear about who we were, we wanted to characteristically offer the experience that, in our case, University of Wisconsin was offering, and that was the big dog in our marketplace. So we wanted to be clear about that.
It's interesting, in the survey that I quoted, a number of these students say, I picked the cheapest place. Mm-hmm. And there's an interesting interplay between price and quality that you brought up.
Yeah.
And when we ask these folks, how do you determine the reputation or the quality of an institution, their number one answer by far is it's accredited, which tells me they have no basis to decide which is higher quality, Edgewood or the University of Wisconsin, because everybody's accredited, basically. But They don't have any other benchmark to say. So I think in the absence of good quality indicators, why not take the cheapest? If they're all accredited, it's equal quality.
That's right.
I think that's an issue that we all have to wrestle with.
I think the market's a little bit more sophisticated than that. My suspicion would be that in answering that question, they were sort of assuming a set of schools that were in their sort of consideration set, and probably leaving out a lot of schools that weren't in their consideration set, which is something that was predetermined. But I think, just to amend the answer I gave before, I think one of the ways in which price pressure drives innovation is in causing schools to think a lot harder about what value is for the kinds of students they serve. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you've got to figure out what you can cut to bring your prices down. What it can mean is we have to think a lot harder about what it is that our students are expecting to get out of this education and make doubly sure that we provide it. And maybe there's things that we're doing that aren't suited to that specific outcome that we can get rid of. But we need to, if it's employment, if it's, graduate school, if it, whatever that thing is that our students are coming to us for, we need to really understand what that is and make sure that they're getting their money's worth. And I think that focuses leadership and drives innovation more than, what can we do to make this cheaper? I don't think that will be the response for some schools, but it doesn't have to be.
Let me build on that. And going back to your original question, I think it's clearly possible to offer higher education at much lower prices than is traditionally done through maximizing technology, minimizing the role of faculty, and maximizing the self-paced, self-directed nature of the provision, so the student interacting with pre-populated content and the computer using a sophisticated algorithm will serve up the right content at the right time. That's the grand theory, anyway. So I don't think it's not a matter of higher ed is inherently somehow more expensive and will ever forever be so. I think it's a matter, to build on Trace's point, as to if it's possible to convey content and to conduct assessment and ultimately to give credentials at extremely low prices. We see this from the MOOC providers like Udacity, from College for America, even Western Governors. It's clearly possible, that's not the question. The question is, what justifies the cost, the price of alternatives to that? Why pay thousands of dollars more for face-to-face interaction, cohort, beautiful setting, campus, extracurricular activities? And I think no one would question there's value there. I think what's going on is that, has there been higher education overreach? Has that traditional version of higher ed essentially expanded way too far, serving far too many fields, far too many people? And that's the friction point, and we need to constrain that back and allow better fit options, lower priced options to meet far wider needs than we currently do. Or are some of those low-cost models inherently limited, inherently specialized, not a good fit for the typical adult learner who actually may need more support, more face time, more interaction than a traditional student, perhaps? And I think yet we don't have, the missing piece is we don't really have good ways yet, good data that allows us to connect value to price, to your point, David. And until we have that, it's easy for everyone to argue their corner and champion some, it's low priced or it's really prestigious, but nothing really gets to what's the real return on investment. I think that's the million-dollar question: is can we find means to surface the true return on investment in a way that allows us to compare and contrast, or is that inherently impossible?
Well,
So
it may not be the simple. I mean, there may be more elegant ways to do it, but I would argue that the market is in the sorting process now. I mean, we've seen, you presented in your data, the decline in adults that are pursuing higher education since the sort of couple of boom years after the recession. We've seen a steady decline, and yet there's been enormous share shift away from for-profits to not-for-profit schools that have come online. That's a consumer choice that's being made, and that's not about price. That's about other factors in the market that they're taking into account that are driving what they consider to be better value. So
But
it
would
can
you
always be better, but it's,
But in that, I mean, you're right, but in that case, would you say there's actually been any better or worse information? Are those schools subtly different and therefore should be judged differently? Isn't it really extraneous factors that are affecting their initial interest and then their initial lack of interest?
I mean, I just think those extraneous factors are part of the market information, right? It's word of mouth, it's people adjusting. I think what we saw after the recession was that you had this enormous enrollment in 2009 and 2010, and then, the way that's supposed to work is that those students are supposed to come into a job market that's ready to absorb them right after the recession. But the recovery was so anemic and so weak that there just weren't enough jobs to absorb all those people that were coming out of schools. And so you have this enormous backlash that I think we're still suffering from, right? There's still a lot of skepticism about the value of higher education. And to me, that's market information. It may be, inelegant in some ways, and maybe you want to believe it's wrong, but that's the market doing what it is. It's people talking to each other. It's people's perception based on what they observe, and then making a decision like, okay, that school I'm going to enroll in because I think that one is the one that, So yeah, the information could be better. You're right. I mean, I don't disagree that the signaling is not nearly as good as it would be in other consumer areas, but I don't think it's not quite as stark as.
We're seeing part of that share shift go from who may have been in the for-profits. We're seeing that it used to be that private colleges and universities can be more nimble than state and public institutions, and now we're seeing that state and public institutions more and more are offering accelerated programs. They're offering more innovative and flexible options for working adults. So they're being more responsive, and I think that's creating in more affordable ways as well. So I think that's also part of the equation.
So I want to press just a little bit on the just pure price. For the the College Board released a report this week. For the first time in American history, U.S., over half of the freshmen that are going to college are staying home. They're not going to the dorm. 53% of the incoming freshman class is going to live at home instead of go to the dorm. And it's about cost and price primarily from what they said. So it seems to me that people are responding, but they're taking the cheap option, or they're trying to save the money and get the credits.
They're making decisions about where they perceive the value lies, right? So yeah, they're taking the cheap option is a really simplistic way of seeing what's going on there, but they're saying, hey, wait a minute, I understand that there's some value of living on campus, but it's not worth what you're asking me to pay for it. What I want instead is this stuff over here, which I can get without that. Now, some schools are going to respond to that, and some schools aren't, and some schools are going to figure out, well, we're just going to serve the rich kids that can come and live on campus, and some schools are going to say, you know what, it turns out that our students are not coming onto campus, and so maybe we need to rethink how we do things. I mean, I don't find anything too discouraging in that, actually. I think that's...
They're being smart consumers, in a sense. They're more selective.
Yeah, they're acting the way that consumers act. They're making choices about what to do, and the market needs to continue to respond to them so that those choices are better and better. But it's not I don't look at that and see a sign of something that's grim. I mean, I actually think, okay, that should be a wake-up call to a lot of schools that are trying to be like, the Harvard of upper Northwest Nebraska, like it turns out that, maybe that's not the right strategy for you to pursue. You need to think about what you're doing in a different way.
But I do think, but the implication then is, if traditionally you've assumed that living on campus and intimate time with faculty and other students is really important for your learning, then if increasingly people will not access that, being very intentional therefore about how do you replace that. Don't just imply it's a choice, it doesn't matter. I would say it does matter on some level, and the question is if higher education is becoming, I mean it already is primarily non-residential, but there's still a lot of assumptions around value taking place in semi-mysterious ways between faculty and students because they're physically co-located. I don't think we've done enough yet to truly understand how we can replicate that through technology, through being a commuter student. Because if the implication is you're at a disadvantage because you cannot pay, that's going to come back to bite us in terms of completion rates and perceived ROI. And I think some of that is going on. So it's a choice, but we need to adjust the system to respect that choice.
We don't disagree.
No,
I think
know.
It's a glass half empty, glass half full thing, right? I mean,
So the politicians are paying attention to this question too.
Sure.
Hillary Clinton announced last week that her goal is anybody from a family that makes less than $125,000 per year gets free tuition at a public university in state. The Margaret Spellings, who is now the head of the UNC system, announced just a while ago that she's picked 3 universities in the North Carolina system, public institutions. The tuition is going to be $500 a semester at those 3 institutions. So any of you folks from North Carolina that are private institutions, how do you feel about that? I mean, is it fair for the federal government to pick and choose publics over privates? What are the ramifications of politicians trying to force price down like this in one sector of higher ed?
Well, I think one of the best things about higher ed is that it is ideally and very often an engine for social mobility. And knowing as a member of society that you can go to higher education at no immediate cost, even if you're paying it back in some sense down the road, I think is a very powerful message and does get to the heart of the inequities that the current system has. Equally, it's important to have skin in the game for students and their families, and the idea that you are paying it back, ideally tied to income. I think it's all very positive and progressive, and I don't think private institutions as a category should object to that. I think private institutions in this country have weathered all kinds of funding regimes, and the diversity is very positive, and they'll continue to offer various kinds of incentives and financial aid to encourage broad enrollment, and the market will not just run like a herd to the free option. There's clearly a downside to free, and it may limit resources. States may decide, well, we're not going to invest in this anymore. There's all kinds of checks and balances that I think will favor other institutions. But I do think it's a very powerful, the Clinton and other moves, it's a very powerful attempt to correct this underlying gap between list price, at least, and median income. Median income is flat and doesn't seem to be going anywhere other than that. And list price is continuing to climb. Certainly net price is closer and it's less problematic. But I think the principle is the right one. It's getting the mechanics right so it doesn't feel too cumbersome or isn't unnecessarily problematic for private players.
Could be tough to do.
Yeah, obviously, if I'm a private institution in the state of North Carolina, I'm nervous because of the potential impact that. But I think it's well within Department of Education and to pilot these types of innovations, and I think it'll be a good laboratory to see what is the balance there. But obviously, if I'm an in-state school, I'm a little bit nervous. But you know, if you look at community colleges, it's such a heavily subsidized part of higher education that folks are going for almost free right now.
So, so first of all, I don't think that Hillary Clinton's plan has a shadow of a hope of actually getting passed. So it's more a theoretical discussion of priorities and where the long-term agenda on the left is moving, and so it's meaningful from that perspective, but I don't think it's an immediate threat. The Margaret Spellings thing is more interesting, and she's making a choice based on the resources that she has available to her, right? So it isn't, nobody's come down and funding this. She's saying, we're going to figure this out from among the resources, and that's within a context of, an MBA program at UNC Chapel Hill that charges, a very, 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 very high amount of money. So, she's just chopping up the cross subsidies within her institution in a different way to make that happen. And so, I don't, she's sort of adjusting the price pieces, but I don't think that as a whole, the North Carolina state system represents an even greater threat than it did before. She's just, she's making a tactical choice about how to position it, but there's no more money that's kind of raining down on them from some new source that's gonna upset the apple cart. I mean, I think the private institutions in North Carolina are gonna have the same competition they've always had.
A little bit different topic, kind of related. University of Memphis has proposed a 40% increase in the minimum adjunct pay. Everybody's in favor of raising pay for adjuncts, right? From $1,500 to $2,100 for a 3-credit-hour course. So, first time that adjuncts have received a pay raise at the university in 3 decades. And it seems like that's fairly, maybe one of the more extreme examples, but I know of institutions where adjuncts go year after year after year with no increase. And according to the AAUP, about 3/4 of the college professors now in America are adjuncts, and about half the classes taught in all American universities combined are taught by adjuncts. And it seems to me that there's a disjoint here. We want quality education, but we're paying these people kind of a pittance. $2,100 is a big raise from $1,500. What's a reasonable pay for adjuncts, and should we be encouraging more use of adjuncts? And are adjuncts an appropriate way to in a sense, staff our universities, which is what's happening?
Well, it's an interesting contradiction because we started out by saying tuition is out of control and it's way too expensive,
right. And
yet there seems to be not enough money to pay a living wage to the majority of the workforce, and higher ed has gone down the adjunct route precisely to try and save money. And it's hard to point to an institution, if we just look at their revenue and expenses, that somehow making loads of money and and running off with it. So to me, that then therefore comes down to the delivery model, the business model, and it does suggest that, and these are some thorny issues, but it does suggest that higher ed has rationalized in some ways, like let's use lots of cheap labor, but it hasn't rationalized in other ways. Still conducts itself in a manner that harks back to generations ago when the system was much smaller, was much more elite, where an artisan approach to course development, bottom-up, faculty-led at the individual level, made more sense. And it's hard to prove, but it does seem to me that bottom-up model, thousands of institutions, tens of thousands of departments, hundreds of thousands of faculty, often reinventing the wheel, is bound to create some cost bloat, if you like, that is very much tied up in the culture and faculty self-identity. And a lot of the innovation trying to engage with higher ed, if you read between the lines, is really trying to say, let's rationalize course development, let's rationalize teaching and learning, let's get good about consistent pedagogy and assessment rather than personal preference and idiosyncrasies that can work out great but often lead to mediocrity. So I think, to me, this pincer movement is really pointing to the elephant in the room, which is that we haven't adjusted approaches to course design and teaching and learning and assessment to the mass scale that we actually have as a system, and are contemplating even further scale and accommodation. And I'm not saying there's easy answers to that, but it's through some mix of changing the conversation around faculty identity, getting serious about teaching and learning skill development rather than just assuming because you're a faculty member you know how to teach, and getting serious about how technology can much more cheaply both create and deliver courses, deliver certain kinds of assessment, deal with certain kinds of pedagogic setting. Let's make that as cheap as possible, as efficient as possible, and then let's allow perhaps a smaller number of faculty who are very well paid to deal with the face-to-face stuff that technology just can't handle and probably never will be able to handle. And I think unless we sort of get really serious and hard-nosed about that, we'll continue to be in this tricky situation.
Yeah, when you say get serious about this, we're back to market pressure. People aren't going to make those kind of changes unless there's some driving force, do you think? I mean, there's not some innovative person out there that's going to say, hey, we're going to differentiate salaries and faculty workloads, and all of a sudden everybody's going to adopt that. I mean, the system doesn't move that way.
Yes, I mean, it doesn't move as quickly as you'd like it to move, but I think that there are examples of, I mean, this is what I was describing before. So you look at the success of the for-profit model, right? Well, one of the major innovations there is to have a uniform curriculum across the board, right? And you don't spend faculty time, as Richard put it well, with artisanal course design. And I think that innovation has taken hold in the nonprofit world, not everywhere, but I think that there are examples of that happening. I mean, I think that these innovations are trickling in, and yeah, could there be more of them? Absolutely, but it's messy. It's not the way I would do it, but I think you're seeing some of it. I mean, the pricing on the adjuncts is, I read that as 99% politics. I think that if you're making that decision to do it, I would hope that at the back end of that you have some objective goal in mind that will be a positive sort of result, an ROI, if you will, for that investment, which is what it is, right?
You mean from the part of the adjunct or the institution?
No, on the part of the institution to say, okay, we're going to raise these prices. Now, my suspicion is that they're doing it simply for political reasons, right? They're doing it in sort of pressured response. But if you would hope that it's a deliberate choice and that they're making the decision to say, well, we're going to spend this much more on adjuncts, and as a result of that investment, we're going to see X, Y, Z. We're going to see better yield because our incoming population will appreciate that the faculty is going to be better compensated and devote more attention. We're going to have better outcomes because the faculty will be able to spend more time and be more loyal. We're going to have lower turnover. One would hope that they're making those kinds of decisions. I suspect they're not, but
No, my point was, I mean, 2,100 I was laughing at. That's ridiculous to go from 1,500 to 2,100.
But
The
it's
average
a
is-
market clearing price. The 1,500 it's not a feudal system, right? People choose to pursue this line of work. And yes, I agree, it's probably a really poor wage for what they do, and yet they continue to choose to do it.
That's true.
So, you know, that's just the market. There are too many people, you know, with higher degrees that want to teach college, and, you know, the institutions can get away with paying that. If they couldn't get away with paying it, they wouldn't. They pay something else. So the dramatic increase in price like that's why I think it's politics. If it's something else, you know, good for them. They've figured out something that nobody else has figured out that they're going to get as a positive result of giving a huge price increase.
Well, we see the response is happening in the form of unionization. So the adjuncts are starting to, in a sense,
so
push
forestalling
back.
unionization is that's an ROI too, right? If they think that's going to happen. Yeah.
So I want to, back to Richard's point, I want to play a little video here of, are we getting some economies here? Is there some efficiency in the system?
The Science Lab, the place where the textbook meets the real world, where the lecture becomes more than words, where teaching becomes learning. At eScience Labs, we believe that every student deserves access to an authentic and engaging lab experience. However, with the growth of online education, many institutions struggle to provide a real lab experience to students outside of the traditional campus laboratory. eScience Labs works with hundreds of higher education institutions to expand online course offerings, overcome lab space and access issues, promote hands-on experimentation, and increase online student engagement. Online students engage in real science exploration through hands-on experiments, coupled with digital curriculum that provides students a traditional lab experience regardless of time and space. Students can work at their own pace, anytime, anywhere. eScience Labs has solutions for online, hybrid, and even face-to-face courses. We've developed over 400 pre-designed labs to mirror the exact
We get it.
Okay, so is this it, Richard? Are we starting to get some economies here, some scale? And multi-point, 400 labs, and okay, it even works for on-campus students.
I definitely think it's thinking along the right lines. I think the real question will be, it only works in terms of the efficiencies if it's adopted at true scale. And my experience of attempts like this tend to be that it's adopted more piecemeal, you get multiple versions, there's crazy customization.
Yeah.
And that's the only way to allow it to be adopted, but it dilutes the scope for efficiency. And the tension between this idea that the intellectual nature of higher ed demands diversity and critique and not sort of having all your eggs in one basket versus the economic argument which says, you know, we don't need 25 companies like Science Labs, you know, maybe we need 2 or 3, and then mass adoption,
Yeah, so
common curriculum. I mean,
you got to get to standardization somehow and have lots of the same thing, right?
Right.
Before you see the,
Right.
And maybe these science labs, I mean, I think that some of these probably cost a lot to build and no university could afford them, but they may be better than what you get in a typical college classroom.
Right, and I think that's the key question, is can they be shown to be demonstrably better and beyond what an institution could do itself or a faculty member could dream up on their own? And that's what should drive adoption. I mean, there should be some rationality to it, but I think so often it's hard to, with anything as complex as teaching and learning, it's hard to really prove your case to the point that everyone accepts
do
it
it.
and off
Yeah.
they go.
But going back to the, the pay raise for adjunct faculty, you think of adult learners spending 90% of their time on campus in the classroom, or in an online setting, 99% of the time their interactions are with that faculty, or a
Facsimile of a
facsimile of faculty. I think anything you could do to bring those faculty into the mission of the institution, to acclimate them and why you're not just teaching the discipline, but in line with the institution's goals, and I know it was really, in my dean role, it was tremendously impactful to bring them into our faculty discussions, to make them part of our community rather than just treating them like I think many institutions do, is just someone who comes in. They're teaching half the mission of your institution. So we need to do a much better job of bringing them into what we do and why we do it.
I mean, the for-profits are in a lot of ways on the forefront of market pressures, and the pendulum's already swung way back on this topic with the adjuncts. I mean, they've now moved to putting many more people on a full-time basis because they perceive that the outcomes are much better, and so they'll sort of, more of the courses are taught by full-time professors, more of the early stage courses are taught by full-time professors because they find that reduces the amount of attrition that they're experiencing. I mean, to my point earlier, they're making, there's an ROI associated with treating your faculty humanely, that they've already moved back in that direction. So,
Trace, it seems pretty ironic to me that the for-profits are adding full-time faculty and lowering that ratio of adjuncts. Where
they led the
many
way,
of the
they led the way
nonprofits are
toward the
going the other
adjuncts,
way.
right?
They're going more and more adjuncts and more and more part-timers. There's an interesting
They don't have the
play there.
infrastructure.
They also don't have the same regulatory pressure, to be quite honest with you.
Yeah.
Right? They're given more leeway, and so in some ways, and I hear this on the marketing side all the time. I think a lot of traditional institutions that are getting into the market space that had traditionally been the domain of for-profits are making a lot of the mistakes that the for-profits have moved away from. I mean, there's a little bit of that going on.
Definitely that.
Yeah.
So another video here. Want to take it up a notch, see if we can move to a different level here.
And then the last one,
guys-
all I saw that beautiful woman in her designer kitchen doing a lab experiment. All I could think of was like the Saturday Night Live skit with Melissa McCarthy, like like.
Wait a minute, not the video. Just go to the previous slide. I'm sorry, guys. Okay, this is just not a video, but it's a screenshot of a website. This is a course called Hab Worlds, developed at Arizona State University. And I would encourage anybody to go to their web and look at some samples of this course. They advertise it as a really highly rated, students rave about this course.
This is like higher education clickbait right here. Right?
A lot of embedded videos. This is a course that teaches about the solar system, how it was formed. Wonderful videos and interactive activities. But as you read if you can read the header here, it talks about the course, and it says, designed by Professor Ariel Anbar and Dr. Lev something from Arizona State University. Hab Worlds is now available for faculty to teach at your university. And you notice the buttons on the bottom. If you're a student, you go, I want to learn. If you're a faculty member, I want to teach the course. So they're trying to promote this course and basically sell it to other universities as a top, highly rated course. So maybe this is a great course. Maybe everybody should teach Hab Worlds instead of build their own course.
I think it's the right principle up to a point. The idea that through concentrated resources and concentrated expertise, chances are a better product will emerge. And in many courses that are less specialized, we don't need hundreds of versions of them. There's no value add there. So I think it's a cultural issue, is to what extent is it in faculty members' interest or not to say, well, yes, this will save me time, this is a higher quality, I can focus on the teaching, less on the production, or the institution feeling like there's nothing to be ashamed of in adopting top quality content from another institution. But a lot of that does go against the grain of how faculty and institutions think. So I think that's the problem.
It's the point you were making immediately before, right? The only thing that blocks that is sort of ego and tradition and sentiment. I mean, community colleges are teaching with MOOC content, right? That happened almost immediately after the MOOCs started coming out because they had, world famous professors from leading institutions offering this content online. They were sort of embracing it, and then the teacher, the professor in the community college becomes something like a teaching assistant. And yeah, it bruises the ego, but if the content is good and the learning is good, then it's doing exactly what it should at a good price.
And I think there's two layers to it. I think you're right that I'm sure a lot of individual faculty, particularly at two-year schools, are deciding for themselves, I'll adopt that, I'll adopt this. I think what we're not seeing is institutions saying, right, we're going to take this problem seriously, we want institutional level impact, let's commit to this kind of adoption instead of something to allow us to make certain kinds of savings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or
Or even
you
the state
take Cab
system.
Worlds to the Faculty Senate of the University of Minnesota and see how that how that flies.
Right, but maybe North Carolina, right? I mean, if they're going to the system setting the price, maybe the system can pick a few textbooks. And
Right.
Right.
We've only got $500. We have to go to Cab Worlds.
Right, how do you get to that
Closes our
price
course.
point if you don't do that kind of thing
Yeah, interesting.
without crazy subsidy?
Yeah.
I mean, I think the more relevant example is something like, the notion that, college level algebra is this, super special content area that every single professor needs to craft by hand, right? I mean, it's really those sort of entry level, frankly, commodity courses. I mean, this is kind of like this is something odd, but it's really those sort of commodity level, entry level first 2-year courses where, and the problem is that, this gets into the weeds here, but, higher education is this grand system of cross-subsidization, right? So the dirty secret is that all those giant lecture classes and those commodity courses subsidize the upper level courses, right? And the undergraduates subsidize the graduates. And so once you start monkeying around with this stuff, you run the risk of upsetting the apple cart. But ultimately, I think the market is going to insist on that, right? Especially if people are staying home and not going into the dorms, and they're clearly making choices.
Exactly. So there's a website called TES, T-E-S. It's for K-12 teachers, but it's a place where you share materials, make it, take it kind of thing. Any school teacher in America can put materials on there and sell it, right? Yeah. There's people making 6-figure incomes, designing worksheets for 5th graders and selling it on TES. Udemy is a similar site for
teacher pay
classes.
teachers.
Right. So Udemy, you can design a class, put it up there. Professors from big name universities are creating courses, putting it on Udemy, and making good money from their course. Is it appropriate for faculty members who are paid employees of the university to take their expertise and their ability and then start selling wares on sites like this and kind of making a side income from their expertise?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very appropriate, and I think it's a market-based way of trying to separate the course design role from the teaching role, and they may be combined, but they're rather separate things. But what strikes me is that those models are all consumer-oriented, meaning it's individuals making choices on their own, and that's fine, and I guess it could scale up, but it still feels like the real opportunities, could an institution somehow adopt that approach through such a site, or because the problem is there's been no shortage over the last 20 years of attempts to do this kind of thing, like Merlot, for example. Massive repository of courses, learning objects, and so on. The idea is that, why not adopt rather than duplicate? But it doesn't seem to have been able to overcome cultural resistance. So the availability isn't really the problem. It's the motivations to actually behave differently in response to that availability.
If we get enough adjuncts, though, that are busy, pressed, and not paid very well, and they have responsibilities for course design, maybe the movement will get going. Just go buy the Abworld
But it's
course
hard to
and buy
say we
some
don't-
stuff from TES.
When you look at the kind of best practices at the community college level, you're seeing a lot of this already, right? When you look at you look at what some of the higher education textbook providers are doing in terms of adapting their materials and incorporating adaptive learning, and you have those are being adopted institution-wide to say, okay, we're going to teach math this way, and I don't care, all the professors are going to use this material and they're going to teach it in this order, we're going to take advantage of these things. And then up at the very high end with the elite universities, they're content to have their professors designing their algebra courses.
And selling them like this.
It's the
like
stuff in
Arizona
the
State.
middle, right? It's the folks that are in the middle where there's some friction, I think, to Richard's point earlier, right? There's a lot that large middle portion is where stuff is still being worked out, and that's where the egos are the most sensitive. Like, is my school, I'm not a community college and I'm not Harvard, I'm somewhere in the middle, and I get really sensitive to what I'm being asked to do and how much autonomy I'm giving up, and and that's where most of the students are. So that's why it's a problem. But there are examples of it working
That's a good point. It starts popping up. You don't know how wide scale that's becoming. Let's look at this last video. I just had to play this because I think it's such a cool phenomenon, and we can talk about it. Maybe this is where we wind up. So here's some pretty cool technology, right? You get the virtual world interacting with the physical world. You get kids and dads interacting and playing this game. It seems like there's a whole lot of potential here. If we could get educational technology doing stuff like this in a course like Have World. And it seems like we're getting close if they can make this happen across the world.
So I think it certainly speaks to the value of combining technology and real world, individual and social. I think all those are good pedagogical principles. I think the big question is, it's much easier to create a game where there's no consequence, no assessment, purely voluntary, ultimately trivial, as opposed to a sort of make or break mastery assessment, pay a lot of money. And I think that's why there's been this lag between gaming in the general sense versus, say, educational gaming or whatever the equivalent is. Partly the lag is because the investment is so fragmented, and companies know that if they produce some wonderful game, it may only be adopted by 1% of the market, and the rest will decide, oh, it's not for me. And there isn't that, it's this complex mix of it's partly a consumer market, partly an institutional market, and the market isn't really comfortable with adopting external things and standard things. So I think that the technology is clearly becoming more interesting by the day, and speaks to the fact that technology isn't the whole answer. It's something much more complicated than that. But I still think it just comes back to the cultural differences that explain the lag and explain why we don't have the equivalent enthusiasm for the educational version of such a thing at the moment, really.
I think you should press Scott on when Kale is going to start, endorsing the acceptance of Pokemon Go credits.
Yeah, that's right. How many?
Some of that's college level learning.
Yeah, it's prior. It's a lot of learning going on there, right? And you build in a
see all that
few
math that's
historical,
going on the screen?
some historical figures and facts about some of these places, and you start learning history. And so reminds me. Remember the old Oregon Trail? One of the first. Kind of interactive.
I think that's the next thing that'll come back. We'll get Oregon Trail 3D.
3D.
You'll like see the people dying right there in front of you.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe that's where we're going. There's some hope there, I think. We got a few minutes left here. We're going to wrap up. Give each one of you guys a chance to say, what do you think is a big or a couple big challenges that are out there that folks in the business, in the trenches, building and running online programs, servicing students, trying to get more people educated, what do you think are the big issues on the horizon they should be paying attention to? Trace, you go first, work our way down.
Well, I'll give my little speech. There's sort of two things that I harp on, and the people who had the misfortune to sit next to me at dinner last night already heard some of this. But the first is differentiation. So trying to, to my snarky comment about the Harvard of the upper, Northwest Nebraska, figure out which who you're serving well, which students at your institutions are really knocking it out of the park and having the outcomes that everybody wants them to have, and then focus in on those and stop trying to serve a too broad a range of student, really understand who your certain student is and really narrow in on that area where you can market that and serve that student well. So that's one of my mantras. The other thing that I'm a huge fan of these days is big data. I mean, there are companies out there that are doing really innovative things with data that you can partner with. Burning Glass, is one of them, is maybe the best known one, but they're, out there scouring real employment data that goes well beyond BLS, right? That actually says, like, where are the needs and specifically where are the needs? It's not enough to say, oh, MBA, but like, what's the narrow sort of specific gap that needs to be addressed, skills gap that needs to be addressed, and where is that happening, and how can I kind of participate in filling that gap? That's a big one for me. I think that there's this is an overused line too. There's no one out there that's holding their breath, waiting for your BSN degree to finally arrive, right? That's just not the case. So everybody wants to be in BSN because BSN is working, but think about leapfrogging over that into the thing that nobody's doing yet, which is like, what's the more specific degree program serving the more specific geographic audience that's really underserved? And it's not going to be something giant. It's going to be something really narrow. And that narrowness, that specificity is something that's now finally becoming available through the use of big data. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, where we're headed. So that's my speech.
Yeah.
Great. Well, what we're seeing is colleges and universities who want to serve the adult learner in new ways. And we're finding that historically they've operated often by themselves in a decentralized form, but now we're seeing those institutions work together as systems. We're seeing more systemic use of innovations like prior learning assessment, like competency-based education, that they're working together to serve the unique needs of adult learners. The prior learning assessment aspect of it is something that obviously with our research has really come to the forefront over the last 5 or 6 years, and there's a real opportunity to do that in a scalable way that really impacts critical decision factors for adult learners.
It's interesting, there's like 26 million Americans, right, that have some college credit but don't have a degree.
That's right.
If you took those 26 million and added up all the experiential credits they probably deserve and value, a lot of them may have degrees, or you'd have a lot of people closer if they could put that together.
Well, a big piece of that is getting closer to the finish line, but another piece is just valuing what those students bring to our classrooms, whether that's online or in person. Mm-hmm. And from an adult learning perspective, by valuing that, you have a intrinsically motivating piece that improves persistence and retention.
Good. Richard?
I would say taking a hard look at ways to change the culture around teaching and learning, going beyond the labels, the buzzwords, online, CBE, that so often leave those vital details that actually characterize the student experience just somehow for granted or in the hands of individual faculty.
Or adjuncts.
Or very often adjuncts, yes. And I think unless as a culture we can begin to grapple with those things, then my concern is that all this energy and innovation capital will not be as impactful as we would all like.
Good. Gentlemen, thank you. Appreciate your thoughts, your ideas, your background that brought you to this point. We want to thank each of you for participating in Connect this year, and safe travels. We hope to see you all next year at this place, and we'll wrap up with the panel just like this and see where we are a year from now. Be well.